One thing about if we talk about intuition is also a question of what about love, for example, right? If you choose a partner.
Love is not necessarily an intuition. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a seeming. Maybe you could say like it makes this person seem desirable or seem like a love object, but it's really like a feeling of attraction or a feeling of desire. And I think that's not quite the same as an intuition. And I also think that we can get better at having gut feelings by giving ourselves more input, more trial and error, cultivating deeper self knowledge about where some of our intuitions and gut feelings might be coming from.
Hello and welcome everybody to our new podcast episode. I'm here today with Jes Heppler, and Jes is at the University of California, Berkeley right now. She's finishing her dissertation about the topic of gut feelings and embodied epistemology. So super interesting topic. Jes is our fourth fellow actually in our fellowship program in our foundation, the Foundation for Philosophical Orientation. And yeah, the fourth fellow, and super excited to have you here today. Welcome, Jes. How are you?
Thank you, Reinhard. Happy to be here today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Super interesting topic today. So yes, your dissertation is gut feelings and embodied epistemology. So I think yeah, we can dive right into our topic. And I mean, very interesting topic for sure. Gut feelings is something I think we can all relate to. I've had many gut feelings. There's many decisions I think where I had a certain gut feeling and then decided or in a certain direction, or where you notice that eventually it was originally your body comes first and reason comes second, right? That's an intuition that I've always had, and that's interesting to explore with you. Maybe before we go into that topic, yeah, maybe you can say a few words about yourself, kind of where you came from, and what brought you to this topic of gut feelings.
Thanks, Reinhard. I grew up in New York, in the suburbs of New York City, and I went to college at SUNY Geneseo, which is a small public liberal arts college where I developed my love for philosophy. I had some truly phenomenal mentors and advisors when I was there who brought me into the world of philosophy and really encouraged me and nurtured me, and probably are a huge part of why I ended up getting into PhD programs in philosophy and going to Berkeley. And I've always been interested in philosophy of perception. So, questions about the nature of seeing, the nature of how we make sense of the world, kind of going beyond like the mind body problem in the classical sense, and more toward the questions about how do we know what we're seeing? How do we make sense of what we're seeing? And it's kind of funny. I was reflecting that I actually wrote my grad school writing sample, like to get into grad school on intuition. And so to come back around to the topic, but in a super, super different way, has been really cool.
Oh wow, interesting. So the writing sample in order to get into the PhD. Oh, very
Yeah.
interesting. So
Yeah.
the so is was there a moment when this topic first encountered you? Like was there even maybe, I don't know, like some thoughts when I think back to my philosophical thinking, some go back to childhood even, right? And so I don't know, was there ever a moment when you're like, huh, I wonder what this is?
Yeah. I think that I'm someone who thinks a lot about how we know what's authentic for someone. And often for me, I've found that as much as I've wanted the answer to why I want this or that to be rational, a lot of times it's come down to an intuition or a bodily response, which is then, as you say, followed by reason. And I did one of my qualifying exams on reasons and on alienated belief. So those beliefs that we have, but we sort of reject in ourselves. And wrestling with that topic really brought me to this way that we often rely on non-rational processes to make major, major decisions about our lives, about ourselves, about who we want to be with, what we're going to do with our life. I mean, even grad school, that came down to an intuition for me. I was very lucky to have a few amazing choices. And I was making a pros and cons list and trying to be really rational and give weights to different topics and rank a school for location, for faculty, for interesting seminars, etc. And as I was doing the pro cons list, I was like, why am I doing this? I clearly feel drawn to go to Berkeley. And at that point, just feeling drawn is enough when I have many good choices. But of course, it's not always such an easy situation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. And I can relate to this, right? Where sometimes you make pro and con lists, and these lists, they often only help you to solidify what you already know.
Hmm. Right. It's like when you flip a coin and you just flip it to see which result you're unhappy with.
Yeah, right. So for gut feelings, do you have something maybe also for our audience, right? Like a working definition, something that, you can go from? Because everybody has a gut feeling about what gut feelings are. But is there something that you have in mind?
So I distinguish gut feelings from intuition, and that becomes important because the body comes into a lot of what I'm talking about. So let's start with intuition. I define intuition as a seeming, meaning that it makes the object of the intuition seem a certain way. And that seeming is conscious, we're aware of it. It's intentional, which means it is about something. It's spontaneous, meaning we don't sort of go looking for the intuition. It's not inferential, meaning we don't go through a series of inferences to arrive at that seeming. And it also has an opaque source, meaning that we don't know where it's coming from. The distinction that I make between intuition and gut feelings is that gut feelings are intuitions with an embodied mode of presentation. So the way that we come to know that we're having a seeming is not because I think that person seems suspicious or this contract seems off, but rather it's because of a bodily feeling that I'm having about the object of the intuition. And so it's my bodily feeling that makes it seem a certain way.
That makes sense. So it's a bodily feeling, and that's in distinction from intuition. Is that how you define it?
So I see gut feelings as a subtype of intuition.
Mm.
So I argue that intuitions can present in different modes. And
Mhm.
that is to say that we can have the same seeming, say that person is untrustworthy, but it can actually present to us in many different ways. And that presentation is referring to the phenomenological aspect of it. So how that intuition appears to us in experience, how we know in our experience that we're having an intuition. And we can know from having a thought, we can know from perception. So that stick seems longer than that stick when you put it underwater. And we can also know it through our bodies. But it can all be the same content, which is that this person seems sketchy.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, the deeper question, right, that is involved here is also the question of mind-body, right? That distinction, like the deeper, I guess, philosophical question and how these two interact. And there's always a question of, yeah, what does our body tell us, and how is our mind distinct from it, or it's not, right? And so that is something I think where especially more recent philosophy has focused on these connections between between the body and the mind, right? And I mean, one of the famous philosophers who was focusing on the importance of the body was Nietzsche, for example, right? And so that's maybe also an interesting quote where we could begin is, this famous quote by Nietzsche where he says, "There is more wisdom in your body than in your deepest philosophy." Right? And so there's this distinction, or there's at least this idea of there's wisdom in our body, right? And that's something I think that you also seem to investigate to some regard, right? That there's something important going on in our body, what the body tells us, what you're saying, kind of like these ways of, I mean, you call it embodied epistemology, right? So there's wisdom, there's knowledge in our body, and so maybe, yeah, what are your thoughts on what is wisdom, right?
Yeah, I think the question about the wisdom of the body or the epistemology of the body versus epistemology generally is an interesting question. And I think in some ways, with philosophy, we're always trying to take experience and take the truth about certain things and put it into words. And that's a really hard thing to do. And there are so many different ways to do this, right? Poets do the same thing, artists do the same thing, try to take something about the nature of reality and put it in another form that we can, wrestle with it, and with philosophy where we can argue about it. And so I think that it's true that the richness of the body and the fineness of grain of experience, of feeling, of evaluation that we have in the body, it's really hard to reduce that to words. And I think part of what captivated me about this topic was that so often we make decisions based on our bodily responses and then come up with reasons after. But I wanted to know what's going on with the body before we come up for the reasons afterward. And I think that my dissertation is an attempt to bring the lens of critical inquiry to what is happening in the body and asking, well, how do we know what an intuition feels like? How do we know when something is an intuition or anxiety? And there are all these ways that we reason well with rational reflection and logic, and thank goodness for that. And when and where are we justified in relying a bit more on the body? Or are there places where the body can guide us a bit better than reason or argumentation? I'm not sure if I answered all your questions.
No, no, no. That's. I mean, that's a good entryway, right? I mean, I mean, the with I think with the philosophy of orientation, it's quite useful here to think about as different footholds, basically, right? Or different guides or different signs or clues or indicators, right? And so you can focus on the body on the one hand, right? And then, but it's of course it's the mind that interprets it, right? And so I'm the mind that interprets it. And on the other hand, you have rationality and rational laws, and there's mathematical tools and so on, right? And so these are both, I think, different footholds in our orientation, and we rely on, I mean, usually on both of them, right? In everyday life, at least, we rely on both of them, and so we kind of we oscillate between them, right? We focus maybe more on the body sometimes, and we try to understand it, and then sometimes more on the mind, and we ask ourselves, what can we trust our gut in this moment or not, right? And so, I mean, one thing in terms of the question of the wisdom, right, is if there is wisdom in our body, right? Let's say, I have a gut feeling about, yeah, as you said, right, you want to go to Berkeley, right, or about a certain profession, like these very important decisions sometimes, right, that you want to go become, yeah, a doctor or something like that, and then that's what your gut is telling you. I guess then the question of what kind of wisdom is this, right? Like where does it come from? I mean, is this because I mean for example, the in ancient times, right, the idea of gut feelings or intuition was often connected with divine beings in a sense, right? So who, because they are not tied to a body, they know everything better, right? And then they have, a vaster overview of things. And and that's something that's not real. I mean, for some people that's convincing today, but for many, it's not, at least in the scientific community, it's not, right? And so yeah, what are your thoughts about where does this wisdom come from?
Mm, it's a great question. So I think for wisdom, it's worth naming that when we say wisdom, we're talking about a trustworthy source of information, generally. If there's wisdom, it's sort of tried and true. We can rely upon it. It's trustworthy. So we can use wisdom as a shorthand for that. And I think that as for where it comes from, the question of etiology, or basically where does this come from, is an interesting one. So some people have argued that our intuitions come from a mix of instinct, of memories, of experience, and all of those things create what we might call our implicit knowledge. And this is the kind of thing where if we are an expert at, for example, judging whether a statue is a counterfeit, we can judge immediately. We don't have to think about it. We don't have to go down a checklist that an art history student might use to figure out whether it's a genuine artifact. We just know because we've done it so much. And this is the case of the expert, of course, where there is a lot of experience, there's a lot of trial and error, and a really good track record of judging well. And then, of course, there are more instinctual cases of intuition. So that might be what we see in the social realm. When I have a really sketchy feeling about this person who's at my door telling me that something has gone wrong and I need to go with them, I'm getting a bad feeling and I should absolutely not go with this person, even though they're saying there's this really dire situation and I need to help them. There's also, of course, situations where we might meet someone who reminds us of someone else in our life. So if we had, a problematic boss in our 20s or something, you might meet someone and immediately dislike them and realize not that they're a bad person, but that they remind you of someone that you worked with. And so we have all this associative learning and this implicit learning that makes us really good at navigating the world. And often gut feelings are informed by these past experiences and instinct. The problem, of course, is that intuitions, because they're non-inferential and because they have this opaque source, we can really only ever make hypotheses about where our intuition is coming from. And so determining whether intuitions really are wise or whether it's relying on a past experience that actually maybe isn't the right past experience to pull on in this case, that requires a lot of discernment and a lot of self-knowledge.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So it is, I mean, it's very hypothetical, right, in terms of where it comes from. And I like how you put it, right? Is like it's on the one hand, yeah, it's past experiences, traumatic experiences sometimes, right? And there's
Mhm.
so how and since I mean since we just talked about the orientation terminology, how Stegmaier puts it is that they are in a way experiences, past experiences that in a sense create abbreviation. So they're like I think he says in one kind it's sedimented orientation experiences. Right.
Mm.
So and
Mhm.
uses the concept of incorporation, right? So we incorporate them, which is by the I mean it comes from Nietzsche. It's kind of like this. It's a Nietzsche metaphor, right? But how we incorporate certain things, and they create certain structures in our body, right? And so just like when you're just like in our brain, right? There's like certain brain structures, and the more often they're used, the stronger these lanes become, right? And so in a way of like if we have a lot of experiences in a certain way, we will remember them in the same way, and then it becomes faster, right? So it's an abbreviation of our orientation in a sense, right? So if we exactly, if we had a bad experience with somebody, and then maybe again, and then in the future, you will be careful with that person at least, right? Because you have made bad experiences.
Mhm.
Um, and so, I mean, and that would be one way to explain it in a kind of genealogical or evolutionary kind of perspective. Um, I mean, does that make sense to you, or how do you think about those things?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think, well, I guess I'll throw in one thing that might complicate that a little bit. So we have bad experiences over and over again, and we can eventually learn, wow, this creates a bad outcome for me. I'm going to do something really different. On the other hand, another case that I often think about with gut feelings is the case when we keep making the bad choice over and over again, and we can't really stop doing so. And often you mentioned trauma that goes back to early childhood, and we get our sort of schemas of what love looks like, of what attachment feels like. And this is an interesting case because when it comes to gut feeling or intuition, who you're automatically drawn to, if you keep dating people who are mean to you and you're in therapy and working on not doing that anymore, that's going to mean a period of not listening to your gut because you know that your gut is reflecting most likely this schema of being drawn to people who are going to be mean to you. And so it's going to be pushing yourself to connect with people who feel a little bit different, maybe a little bit with this person, a little bit more with the next person, to sort of accustom yourself to experiencing love from someone who isn't mean to you. And so when it comes to breaking certain patterns or creating new habits, those are often going to be cases where we don't want to listen to our gut feelings, especially if we know that we've been drawn to the same choices over and over again and we want to make a different choice.
That's an interesting example, right, of how, and it goes hand in hand with this idea of how certain patterns develop themselves, structures develop, and you remain in these structures, right? And that it's a matter of becomes, I mean, just like habits, right? It becomes harder to change them. Um, and I guess, I mean, I mean, one question I had for you was, yeah, and we can talk about this in the sense of, um, yeah, what is our freedom to influence them, right? And so, in a sense of just as you just said, right, there's a certain level of where they have a very a strong influence on us, and we might not be able to change them, right? Um, and it's also a question of how much we can trust them, right? And so it's like there's something about can we influence our own gut feelings? I mean, things I was also thinking about is in terms of depending on my own state, right? If I'm anxious, if I'm stressed, if I'm hungry, if I'm, I don't know, having a good time, I'm probably going to have different gut feelings about certain decisions. right? If I'm stressed for a long time, if I'm happy for a long time, or also yeah, certain situations, right? Um, yeah, do you have thoughts about those things, like how I can influence my own gut feelings?
Yes, so many thoughts on this question. So, as far as influencing our own gut feelings, for the same reason that we can't know where our gut feelings come from, we also can't guarantee that we're going to be able to push our gut feelings in another direction. So, if my parents wanted me to be a lawyer and I really am trying to make myself want to be a lawyer, I can meet wonderful lawyers. I can read positive stories about lawyers. I can put myself in a position to see the virtues of being a lawyer or going through law school, but I might do all that and I might still really never want to be a lawyer. And so I think that the same way that we can hypothesize about the source of our gut feelings, we can put ourselves in a position to basically get more input for whatever the gut feeling might be drawing on. But there's an element of mystery and an element of personality and an element of some people just desire some things and not others, that it may not necessarily shift our gut feelings. I think when it comes to other topics, we might know with a little bit more certainty that certain inputs might actually shift a little bit. So, learning a new language, generally, it's hard to learn a language as an adult, but people do it all the time. If you give yourself enough input with learning a language and seeing examples of grammatically sound sentences and immerse yourself and do all the things, eventually you'll have an intuition for whether a sentence sounds right or not. And one other case, and this might be controversial, but people talk about implicit bias tests. So, tests where people really quickly associate people of a certain race or gender or whatever else with certain words that have a positive or negative valence. And people have said that based on the research, some of the best thing that you can do to reduce your implicit bias is just to spend time with more kinds of people. So, if you had a slight negative association with LGBTQ plus people, spending more time with LGBTQ plus people intentionally can shift that. And a lot of time it is because of lack of experience and lack of exposure. So that's another interesting case where we do know that certain actions and certain inputs, so to speak, will change the output of the gut feeling. The second part of your question about whether different kinds of biological or psychological states can influence gut feelings, I think we know that all these things can influence how we feel. I can feel really different about my life if I'm hungry than after a really good meal. And I think there are even some communication frameworks where people say you shouldn't enter into a difficult conversation if you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. The acronym is HALT, if that's helpful. Yeah, and Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is a neuroscientist who works on valence and works on interoception, huge fan of her work. She
Mhm.
has a story in How Emotions Work where she goes on a date with someone and she's not that excited about the date, but she thinks, why not? I'll try. And so she goes on the date after she has a long day on campus when she was an undergrad. And she finds that when she's on this date, her face is flushed, her stomach is feeling kind of bubbly, and she thinks, wow, I guess maybe I am more attracted to this person than I realized. And then later on, she gets home and she vomits and realizes that she has the flu. And so she thought that what she was experiencing was attraction, but it was actually the beginning of a sickness. And so the liability to misinterpret our bodily signals with gut feelings is really interesting. And it's one of the things that distinguishes that subtype of intuition from, say, philosophical intuitions or intellectual intuitions. Because when the mode of presentation for intuition is cognitive, when we have a thought that, oh, this doesn't seem like a case of knowledge, or this doesn't seem like a case of free will, that's really different than the visceral intuitions. And because it's happening on the stage of the viscera, so to speak, it means that we might be more liable to confuse intuition with mere affective response, with being hungry, with being a little anxious. And that's part of what makes gut feelings so interesting to me.
Yeah, that's an interesting example, and I can see how that works. So you talk about influencing it in certain ways, right? So you shouldn't be hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Um, I mean, I also see, there's so you can consciously perhaps also get yourself into a certain state where you have certain gut feelings. And then, of course, then the question is, can you trust them? But I'm also thinking in terms of, is there there might, so if you can influence them, if you can influence gut feelings, you can influence decision making. Isn't there also danger more or less, but the danger of manipulation, right? And so I'm
Mm,
thinking in terms of, just simple example like salesmen, really good salesmen, right? The salespeople, they get you into a certain state, right? That's kind of the key idea. They get you into a certain state under which you're more willing to make a certain decision and so on. We would probably call this manipulation, right? Or great speakers in a sense, right? Get you into a certain state. But then also, if you think about mass media these days, right? I mean, if you think about social media and so on, right? That as we know, social media have a strong impact, right, on how we process information, how we view the world, and so on, right? And so, isn't there also the possibility of then, you know, creating those patterns and structures that we talked about earlier in order to influence whole societies, right, or whole groups of people and so on? Just simple example of politics, right? How like there's a strong, polarization in politics in the U.S., but also in other countries, and they work with very visceral images, right? And so it's like very much kind of there's this bodily reaction against the other side, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. Is this something you've thought about at all?
a very rich question. I think that kind of manipulation is already happening and has been happening for a long time. I think that there are even more basic examples that you give, like even more basic than the car salesman. If you go into a store to go shopping or go to a grocery store or a restaurant, every single thing is designed to influence you to make decisions in a certain way. So the lighting in restaurants can affect how much food you order. The level of the music can influence how much clothing you buy at the mall. All of these things are already manipulating us. And I think that you are right that there is this worry about that happening on an even greater scale right now in this era of hyper personalization. So our algorithms are personalized, and social media is designed really to hijack a lot of our judgment facilities. When I think right now, do I have a gut feeling that I want to spend hours on Instagram a day? No, but if I start going on Reels, I'm going to keep going and going and going, which is why I don't have Instagram on my phone anymore. And I think that a lot of times avoiding that influence means that we need to be really careful with what we take in and what spaces we put ourselves in. And in some ways, I think being aware of influence can be helpful. So if you're going to buy a used car, being aware of some of the tactics that might be used on you might be helpful, but you're probably going to be able to avoid that better if you go to a different kind of dealership where they don't use those tactics, for instance. So I think it's tricky and it's a minefield to navigate. And I think that when it comes to gut feelings, cultivating some amount of self awareness and self knowledge about where our own gut feelings are coming from and also what our values are. So, wanting to make sure that our gut feelings are aligned with our values and who we want to become, that's where we have this potential to exercise more agency over influencing our own gut feelings, as opposed to taking in the ways that Facebook or Meta or whatever website wants to influence our gut feelings and our preferences.
Yeah, yeah, no, that makes sense. It also, whenever, at least for me, whenever I notice a salesman is trying to sell me something, I have a bad gut feeling, right? So there's this immediate kind of, okay, I'm not going to deal with this. There's a suspicion towards it, right? And so I wonder if this is also something where with social media, right? Where, they're just really clever in how they do it, right? So you get into it very easily. And so you really have to make a conscious decision to kind of block this out. One thing, another thing, maybe. So you were talking about experts, for example, right, and how what their gut feeling means. There's also one of the books that you also recommended, the Georg Gigerenzer, right, who connects gut feelings, what he calls it, an unconscious kind of intelligence. And intelligence is unconscious, and it's also connected. We don't know where it comes from, as you said, right? It's immediate. It's you quickly know what to do, and how he defines it is that it's always based on lots of experience, right? That's what he says. Lots of experience, and so that's in a sense of, the way how he puts it, right? After you know all the facts, after you've done all the calculating, then you make a gut decision, right? And so, which is one way to view it, right? And I don't know if you want to, criticize that, go ahead. I mean, or like, I don't know, did you have any reactions to this right away to what he's saying, or?
No, I don't think so. I just think he talks about intuition slightly more broadly than I do, but I don't have any big problems with his framework. So
Okay,
continue.
okay. So, and one thing that he says is also this idea of when we live in the world which becomes like a VUCA world, right? Like which is like this volatile, uncertain, complex, and agile, where things are just moving very fast and becomes more and more complex. We need simple solutions, right? We need simple rules of thumbs, and so relying on a gut is actually going to be more successful than relying on calculations and mathematics, right? Because if we live in an uncertain world, we can't calculate everything. Then it's better to rely on our gut, as a basic principle. Um, then actually, okay, I'm going to go a different direction as I was going to go. A different position to this would be, so I've written this essay some time ago about Annie Duke. She's a poker player. She was, I think, the most successful female poker player of all time. And then she wrote a book about decision making. And so she, in her book, it's called Thinking in Bets, right? And so she argues that basically when you make decisions, you should think in bets, kind of what's the likelihood of this? You should try to calculate it basically and then and try to bet on it. How likely is this going to happen? And bet so much money that it would hurt you, right? So that will help you to make a good decision. So if you're unclear, am I going to be in Berkeley in 5 years? What's the likelihood? And if you were to bet on it, that's the most likely outcome, right? But so one of the things that she, for example, says is that at least when you're playing poker, is that you should not follow your gut. That's a situation because you're so overwhelmed by emotions in that situation, right? When you're on a good streak or on a bad streak, that it blurs your decision making and it blurs your way to perceive reality, right? And so in that sense, she argues for step away from the table, think away from it, calculate your possibilities and so on. So get into your rational mind, right? And so, yeah, I don't know what are your thoughts on these two positions or
Yeah, that's so interesting about poker and the influence of emotion and when we should step away and make the calculation and when we should rely on our gut to make the calculation since we're in an uncertain world. I think that it's probably context dependent. And I argue my dissertation for what I call a domain specific reliabilism, which means that if we have pretty reliable gut feelings in certain domains, say about a sense of direction or about who's going to be a good friend or about making calls about your career, if you know your intuition's been really good in these cases before, you can probably trust them going forward. So it's a little bit of a hybrid of that, right? You have some data behind the gut feelings, but you're also still relying on the gut feelings. And I think that there are some cases where we don't want to blindly follow our gut feelings. So I think that in cases when we know that our gut feelings might be influenced by values that we don't necessarily endorse. So if we are thinking about the different ways that social media can shape us, or if we know that we've been exposed to a lot of one kind of ideology and we're trying to think differently about something, then thinking through a problem or a political issue on your own versus taking whatever you heard this or that YouTuber say, that might be a case to not listen to your gut feelings and make your own calculation, so to speak. And I think that in most cases, a hybrid of both is going to be best. I use an example in my dissertation quite a bit. There's something called the gut feelings questionnaire that was developed, I think, in the Netherlands, and it's used by physicians to determine whether a patient can get a certain kind of diagnostic testing or treatment on the basis of a physician's gut feeling that the patient would not otherwise be eligible for. So, a sense of reassurance or a sense of alarm on the part of doctors can indicate with, some statistical significance whether the thing the patient is coming in for is actually dangerous. This is especially true with chest pain. And whether doctors feel a sense of alarm or sense of reassurance is a really good predictor of whether this person's going to need more care. So a sense of alarm on the part of the physician, if everything is checking out normal, but there's a sense of alarm, that could be enough for the doctor to say, let's send you in for testing. And I think that that's really cool because it's a mix of past experiences and data that the doctor has that isn't necessarily easy to put into numbers or to put into axioms. And so it's using that, it's using the patient that's there and saying, I'm here in the emergency room because I'm feeling like this is an emergency. And it's also taking into account all the blood work being normal, despite the sense of alarm, and the doctor wanting to decide to do the safer thing. So, all this is to say, I think that probably a mix of reflection and gut feeling is going to serve us best most of the time. Though, of course, in life, we don't always have the time to gather data or to make the calculations.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's probably also it's an oscillation in most cases, probably, right? That we kind of, or at least that's how I experience is when I'm there's a strong emotion, then I know it's a strong emotion in this moment, and then you might wait for a second, and then you assess it later, right? So time also helps in this sense,
Yeah.
right? And so you might, take this perspective and this perspective. So it's different sources of no, of wisdom in a sense, right?
John Rawls called this reflective equilibrium. So
Hmm.
he was using this in terms of creating a just society. But the idea is you go between intuition and checking in with the people and saying, does this seem like this would be a fair society for everyone? And you're going back and forth and making those adjustments between intuition and reflection.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And the example of John Rawls would be interesting in terms of our moral intuitions, right? That also our morality is based on intuition and on gut feelings, right? Which is also a big topic in Nietzsche, obviously, right? Where like what the sources are. So when you just talked about the expert, right, and how or the doctor, right, and how they have a lot of wisdom basically sometimes, right, and about making the right decisions. That's also something. I mean, you've heard, many like famous successful people where they say they trust their intuition, they trust their gut feeling. Right, leaders often do it in some sense. When all the reasons are done, right, you follow your gut feeling. I mean, this in terms of orientation again, right? It seems to be it addresses exactly kind of what we do in orientation. So meaning that everyday orientation, or we orient ourselves in everyday life, is always more complex than we can ever put into a theory, right? Every theory will always be limited. Every philosophy will always be limited, right? And so that's one of the core ideas, right, of the philosophy of orientation, right? That we try to grasp something which is more complex than philosophy so far has tried to do. And this seems to relate nicely also to your topic, right? And so the question of gut feelings and the wisdom of the body, right? And so, I mean, and since you are kind of you're wrestling with that topic, uh, so what does this tell us maybe also about the limits of philosophy or the limits of theory? Is this something that you've been thinking about in your research?
Yeah, I think in the same way that the body cannot necessarily be contained in words or argument or logic, we're always wrestling to grasp the sense of what's true, of what something is in words. And so there's some limitation just with words in general and also with philosophy, because the structure of logic is going to be able to capture a lot of things, but there are some things that it won't be able to capture. And I do think that philosophy and especially phenomenology and moral psychology try to do a really good job at capturing these cases. So someone might say that we should act for reasons, but being drawn to something is reason enough to act. And this is some of the literature that's in moral psychology that I was grappling with during my qualifying exam. And I also think that phenomenology too has a lot of humility. And I think that there are echoes of that too in philosophy of orientation, where we're not always going to be able to bring subjective experience into the shape of a philosophical argument. And so we're always doing our best to figure out what are we looking at intersubjectively. And I think especially when it's subjective, when it's sensation that we're feeling in the body, there's a lot of trust in ourselves about how we're interpreting it. Are we interpreting this correctly? Do I have a stomach ache or do I feel really bad about starting law school? And all these different questions, I think, are going to inform how difficult it is not only to report on and discern our own gut feelings and intuition, but also to explain them philosophically. And part of how I try to explain them philosophically is to talk about these issues of interpretation, to talk about the ontological structure of gut feelings and explaining these different features and explaining how, when we're grappling with these features in perception, the different kinds of questions of interpretation that come up.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, I think a part of that problem, I mean, as you say, right, it's about yeah, as you say, it's about basically putting something into the language of logic and science, right, which is a language of universalization, right? It's of generalization, basically, right? So you
Yeah.
make general claims about how the mind and the body interact, and the experience of the gut feeling is always going to be something singular in a sense, right? And so, like, my gut feeling in this moment might be a different one from later on. I put this into a language, but the language generalizes, right? I mean, maybe every gut feeling is singular, right? In that sense, maybe we can't even compare them. And I
Mm.
don't know. I mean, the right. So this seems to be maybe a limit of philosophy and of science overall, right? When we deal with our body. So since it is, I think, a problem in a sense, but it's still philosophy deals with that problem, right? And so, but this is something that, Nietzsche, as we mentioned earlier, is somebody who addressed this, that basically the body was kind of neglected in the history of philosophy, right? I mean, with Plato, if you think about this, right, the soul moves on after it's dead. Um, or even, I mean, even in Aristotle, right? But in the whole history, and then in Descartes and so on, so there's a certain neglect of it, and in the Enlightenment, obviously, and so on. I mean, and so I'm not familiar with current research in that field, right? And I know there was this kind of affect turn in a way, but is the work that you're doing, are you somewhat of an outlier? Are you somebody, doing something that's unusual, since you're working more in analytic philosophy, if I'm correct, right? And so are you like the outlier, or is this something that's quite established by now?
Yeah, I think it depends on the space that I'm in, honestly. When I'm in more interdisciplinary space and with other philosophers and cognitive science, especially who are writing about, the enactivist or embodied tradition, or talking about embodied cognition, I think that this stuff is much less fringe than it was even when I started grad school, many years ago. And I think certainly more than 10, 20 years ago. There's so much research on interoception right now, which is perception of sensations inside the body. And so people are grappling with the difficulty of measuring this empirically. People are grappling with defining it. And I think that increasingly questions about what something feels like and the role of the body is coming more and more into philosophy. And I think the continental traditions, as you say, have been maybe grappling with that for a little bit longer than analytic traditions. So Nietzsche talked about the body. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who is someone I rely on, was kind of a trailblazer. He made distinctions about the body and different body representations that are still being used to talk about body awareness across many, many different subfields. People use these distinctions in meditation research. People use this in affect and interoceptive research. So I think that because of all this research happening across many different fields, it is less fringe than it was. It is what made it possible for me to write a dissertation on this at all. And it definitely is more fringe in certain rooms, and I think especially with analytic philosophers. And sometimes I think that there's pressure to frame my project in a way that sort of puts the epistemology first, or that puts the ethical questions first instead of the body first. I think that sometimes people are a little bit confused because there just aren't a ton of examples of people giving pride of place to the body rather than to emotion or something else that is related to the body.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, right? And I mean, just in terms of how also methodologically, right? How you're progressing, how you're doing studies, right? I mean, that's because it's hard to say something about the body in terms of just in terms of logic and universal kind of formulas, right? And so that's maybe a problem.
Yeah, and I should say that my advisors were all trailblazers too in this way. So Alva Noe's Action and Perception, John Campbell's work on body awareness, and Frederique de Vimont, her work on affective bodily phenomenology. All of this paved the way in philosophy and closer to analytic philosophy for me to be able to do the work that I'm doing. So I'm very, very grateful to have advisors who are so sympathetic and supportive to my project that felt like a kind of weirdo project to be doing when I first started it.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. And so, yeah, since we're talking about your project right now, it's a difficult topic, it seems, and you're working with a lot of literature and a lot of terminology. And so you mentioned earlier distinction between gut feelings and intuition, which seems to be also a way of how you're approaching the topic. So I wonder, is there a way of how you could maybe summarize or say, like, kind of, is there a main claim that you have? Is there something how you're, kind of trying to impact the field in some way?
Yeah. So I can say a few of the main claims. So the first is one that we discussed earlier, which is that intuitions have modes of presentation and that we can learn interesting things about the epistemic and ethical dimensions of different intuitions by virtue of looking at the mode of presentation. So, the same as what I said earlier, that we're going to have different questions about reliability, justification, and trustworthiness for intuitions that are intellectual versus intuitions that present to us through the body. Because for the intuitions that present to us through the body, we have questions about affect, about our emotional history, about trauma, even about bias, etc. Another big claim that I make is that intuitions are reorienting. And I argue for all the different qualities I mentioned earlier that intuitions possess. They're conscious, they're intentional, they're opaque, they're non inferential, and that all of these things have a reorienting effect. And one way that we can further operationalize that reorienting effect is by thinking about the way in which intuitions are intentional. And so intentional is kind of a philosophical term of art. It just means that it's about something or that it's directed towards something. And the tricky thing about intuition is that it's directed towards something, but we don't actually have certainty of what the intuition is about. So I might know that I'm having this sense that someone is not trustworthy. I might have this sense that something is wrong with the contract that I'm about to sign, but I don't actually know what it is. And some of the reorienting power is that I'm in this posture of inquiry and of searching and reorienting myself to try to look differently, gather different evidence that's going to tell me what is my body reacting to that I am sensing is there, but seems to not actually be there. And so, one somewhat radical claim that I make related to that is that counterfactually, intuitions and gut feelings have counterfactual truth conditions, which means that there are certain features of an intuition or a gut feeling where if I knew them, if I identified the line that was really sketchy in my job contract, it's not an intuition anymore. It's a belief. It becomes something stronger. And so that to me is proof that intuitions are always about something, even if we don't always find out what it is, even if there are some intuitions that just pass us by and we never get to know whether they were true or not. But it does mean that when something is really an intuition, that there's something it's about. And there's something where if we were to discover that thing, it wouldn't be an intuition anymore. It would just be a justified belief.
Hmm.
And I think, lastly, I argue for a domain specific reliabilism, which I explained earlier. And I also think that we can get better at having gut feelings by giving ourselves more input, more trial and error, cultivating deeper self knowledge about where some of our intuitions and gut feelings might be coming from.
Yeah, interesting. No, that sounds fascinating. So that, I mean, basically, it's an argument also for that there is this richer wisdom, right, which goes beyond what we immediately see through our senses, maybe, and through our rationality, right? And so we should follow something like that. No, that's super interesting. So that brings me actually to one question I was gonna ask you earlier is so this notion, I mean, was because we talked about experts, right? And expert knowledge and this kind of Gigerenzer's understanding of gut feelings. And so then the question is, you said there's certain domains, right? And then there's also the question of what about like old people and young people, for example, right?
Mm.
Maybe is there like do young people have or kids, do they have a different intuition than old people? And then the question of woman and man, right? I mean, there's something what is it? Female intuition is something that people have come across, right? Or but is this not real, right? Is that maybe pseudo or pseudo wisdom, right? And so like if there's wisdom in the body, then do bodily differences also create a different wisdom, right? So meaning
Mm.
if you have an old body, maybe there's different wisdom in a young body, or a female or male, or I mean, right, like these kind of, or let's say a very athletic body, or not athletic body. I don't know. I mean, just kind of throwing these things out. I mean, what are your thoughts about those things?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that even with an old and a young person, for instance, the the inputs that are being taken for the output of gut feelings are always going to be relative to their life and the kind of situations they were in and culture. I mean, when I was living in France, I often was a little bit more worried about safety maybe in a big city than I would be in the US because while I think I'm really good at reading people, I think I'm really good at telling if people are trustworthy, but that's actually culturally contextual. And so the things that might indicate that someone is or isn't trustworthy in another culture might be really different than the things that I'm naturally looking for. And so I think that, young, old, male, female, I think that it's all going to be relative to certain kinds of experiences. I don't think I feel comfortable saying that we can essentialize any of it. I know that there is kind of this idea that women are more intuitive. I would be curious actually to look at the interoception research and think about whether, something about being a woman results in a different kind or greater body awareness. Because if anything, I think that it's probably relative to body awareness. And in that case, I feel like I know a lot of male meditation teachers who I know from the meditation world who probably have great intuition and who have really cultivated their relationship with their interoceptive signals and interoceptive accuracy. So I think that there are probably certain life experiences that make us more or less liable to interpret things in certain ways, more or less liable to be comfortable with our bodies and listening to our bodies. But I don't think I'm comfortable really essentializing it in that way. And I think for young and old too, we tell little kids if we teach them about stranger danger and about, don't let a random person come and tell you that I sent you to pick you up from school. And we tell even little kids to trust their gut and that if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And so this speaks in a way to something that's maybe a little bit more innate, where kids, at least at a certain age, have a sense when things aren't right. I mean, it's like dogs have this too, right? Like if a dog doesn't like or trust someone, you know. And, of course, different people are more or less trustworthy naturally, maybe depending on life experiences. But I think there's probably some amount of instinct that we're all born with that's evolutionarily wired to keep us safe.
I mean, maybe to follow this line a bit further. I mean, one thing about if we talk about intuition is also a question of what about love, for example, right? If you choose a partner, and is there something how again men and women, but also maybe other people, there's more intuition, or you can trust your gut more than others, right? And so, I mean, in general, in my experience, right, in my experience, that women have a better gut. You can have a better feeling about this than men, and
Mm.
that's me speaking as a man, right? But yeah, what are your thoughts about this? But of course, it's hard to generalize these things again, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, in a way, I talk about this a bit in my dissertation that when we're thinking about gut feelings, it starts to sound a lot like emotion. People talk about emotion as an embodied appraisal, and we have this all the time. I mean, when you see something you're scared of, my friend was showing me this like old part of their apartment. There was literally a creepy mannequin holding a monkey in a corner, and like my stomach dropped. I was so scared. And that's an embodied appraisal, but it's not an opaque source because I know exactly what caused it. It was the creepy mannequin in the corner with the monkey. And with love, of course, love is pretty mysterious. But I think that love is not necessarily an intuition. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a seeming. Maybe you could say like it makes this person seem desirable or seem like a love object, but it's really like a feeling of attraction or a feeling of desire. And I think that's not quite the same as an intuition. But I also think that, like I said earlier, there can be gut feelings that come up. Like if you're like, oh, I have a gut feeling that me and this guy will be a really good match. And then being like, oh, this is actually the same kind of person I've dated many different times. And there are red flags that say that he's probably going to treat me in this way I don't want to be treated. So if you come up against that, then you're more in the realm of gut feelings. Um, and I think that there you can say, I can feel this desire for this person, but I'm seeing from rational reflection these things that are probably not great signs for what a relationship will be like. So I'm gonna say thank you next.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's super interesting. I know it's very speculative, right? So yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of delve into those topics. Maybe to yeah, one more thing that we can talk about. So I have this quote by Einstein, which apparently is only ascribed to Einstein, but it has still has an interesting idea, and it kind of captures some of his thoughts, right? So the idea is that the quote, the false quote goes like, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift, right? So are we an overly rational society today where we have forgotten our intuitions? Would you agree with that, or what do you
Mm,
think?
yeah, I mean, I think both are important, and I think we would be lost without both. This is a good fake Einstein quote. I love fake quotes that are still so good that we have to use them. So I do think that there is sort of this renaissance of the body and of intuition happening right now. And maybe it's just because of, people react kindly to me when I tell them at dinner parties what my dissertation is about. But I think that in my research and in talking to people, it really seems like there is this turn towards the body that's happening. It's happening in psychology. Somatic therapies are becoming a lot more common, more commonly covered by insurance. So there's somatic experiencing, there's EMDR, there's research on mindfulness and yoga-based therapy and movement-based therapy. And I think that in this realm of psychology, people are saying, oh, our body actually has a lot more to do with our wellness, with our emotional regulation, with our sense of self than we initially thought. And that's largely thanks to a lot of the research on interoception and affect that I mentioned earlier. And I think that as this begins to happen and there's more science, our society that is very comfortable in the realm of reason and the realm of logic, um, it's almost this bridge in a way, because then people are becoming more comfortable thinking about the body and thinking about the role of the body in shaping the self and reasons and how we live our lives. And I think that that opens the way for people to tap into more experimentation and thinking, what does my body say about this? Like, what emotion is this weird heaviness in my chest? And how do I name that emotion? And what do I do with that emotion? How do I take care of these different sensations? And how do I treat them and listen to them? So, at least in my corner of the world, I feel like this is happening more and more. And it often is hard because we're taught that we should have reasons for everything. Everything should have a reason. Everything should be evidence based. And for a lot of things in our world, we definitely want that. We do not want to be without evidence. We want to have good reasons. We want to have really solid research. But if you're deciding, you know, which of these two jobs do I take? Which of these four really cool grad schools do I go to? Who am I drawn to talk to at this party? It can be interesting to experiment and say, well, like, what do I feel about it? What do I feel drawn to? And these low stakes situations can, I think, be really good ways to get a little bit more comfortable with seeing what the body is saying and seeing what happens if we listen.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. So it comes in waves in a sense, right? And if you think back, I mean, even in there was Enlightenment and then there was Romanticism, right? Which also focused on the intuition and so on, right? So it, and then again, if you look, early 20th century and expressionism, and so there's certain streams where you definitely focus on those aspects again, right? So I like that idea. There's a kind of dialectic maybe happening. Since you, yeah, maybe just a final thought, since you just mentioned of what people can do, right, in order to maybe expand their ability to think with their gut or to use their gut to orient themselves with their gut. Yeah, I don't know, anything practical that you, and since you've been thinking about this for a while, is there a way how we can improve our ways of orienting ourselves with our gut and to make use of that wisdom, I guess?
Yeah. So, insofar as gut feelings are about our interoceptive signals or sensations inside the body and to subtle changes in the body, one of the best things that we can do to improve our interoceptive sensibility and accuracy is to meditate. I'm working on a paper right now about this and just doing focused awareness meditations and focusing on the breath and doing body scan meditations. For most people who are not accustomed to being connected to their body, this is one of the best ways that you can sort of just get familiar and get curious. Like, what does it feel like to just sit and to be in your body? What is it like to just breathe? And noticing all the little different signals that happen, the little moments of tension, the moments of relaxation, what feels good, what doesn't feel good, and just taking time to very, very consciously notice what's happening in the body can, I think, begin to improve our interoceptive sensitivity when we're just out in the world. And I think it can be a little much for people in the beginning, actually. If they've been really shut off from their bodies, it can be slightly overwhelming. So I'd recommend going in slowly. There are really great guided meditations on all sorts of apps. The Insight app, the Plum Village app. I think you mentioned, Reinhard, to me, the Wake Up app. There's many different options, and working with a teacher is always a good idea. Oftentimes, people will sort of develop this whole new realm and this whole new stage of bodily sensation. And the thing that is then helpful to cultivate after that is equanimity, which is being able to experience all kinds of sensations, including uncomfortable ones, and being able to remain in a really accepting and curious and open state and not needing something to happen, not needing certain sensations to come or go or clinging, but just being able to bring this lens of curiosity and compassion to what's happening in the body. I think this is one of the things that has definitely improved my interoceptive sensitivity and awareness. And I am curious about research in the future that might say the extent to which that does or doesn't bear on intuition.
Nice. Yeah, no, I like that a lot. And these are beautiful words for the end of our podcast. So thank you so much for joining me today, Jess. And yeah, any final thoughts that you have or anything that you would want to share?
Thank you, Reinhard. It's such a pleasure to talk about my work with you today. And yeah, listen to your gut once in a while in a low stakes situation, see what happens.
Perfect. Yeah, that sounds good. And yeah, thank you so much for joining me and good luck for the final months of your dissertation. And I know it's a tough time, but you're almost there. So you got this. And yeah, well, thank you so much. And I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Reinhard. Take care.
Right, bye bye.